At Blinds.com, it's not just about window treatments. It's about you, your style, your space, your way. Whether you DIY or want the pros to handle it all, you'll have the confidence of knowing it's done right. From free expert design help to our 100% satisfaction guarantee, everything we do is made to fit your life and your windows. Because at Blinds.com, the only thing we treat better than windows is you. Visit Blinds.com now for up to 50% off with minimum purchase plus a professional measure at no cost. Rules and restrictions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I am very pleased to welcome to the show Lauren Johnson. Welcome.
Hello, Rebecca. Hello, other humans who I don't live with.
I get ready to tell we're going to have a good time today.
Yes. I've mainly seen people who live in my house recently, so this is very exciting.
I'm pumped today to talk to you about the subject matter of your most recent book, which is Margaret Beaufort, Survivor, Rebel, Kingmaker. Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. Okay, so the first question is it Beaufort or is it Beaufort or how do you pronounce it?
Good question. I would say Margaret Beaufort. Okay. But, I mean, it is kind of pretending to be a bit French, so it probably would have been Beaufort, you know.
Oh, yeah, that sounds pretty fancy, doesn't it?
Yes. And Margaret, she did speak a lot of French, and she also loved a Marguerite pun. Loads of her books are illuminated with daisies, which are marguerites in French. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just read about that in your book, and I was kind of amazed. I did not know that the daisy was Marguerite.
Yeah, and she just loves them. There's puns all over everything. Her and Henry Tudor, big on puns.
Not something you would think. When you look at the historical figures, you see them as kind of flat and dull, don't you?
Yeah, I think especially Margaret and her son Henry Tudor, Henry VII, because the pictures of them are very much from later life. They look so, well, Henry VII's got this sort of weird little twinkle going on. Yeah. It doesn't look great. And Margaret literally just looks like a nun. Yeah. And it's amazing, how much vivacity and dynamism and interest and humor was behind those images, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I love those images. I wish we had a earlier image of her where she was dressed differently or something.
Yeah, because we have information about her clothes and we know, it's really only the last 10 years of her life when she's a vowess. So she's almost like a nun, but her husband's still alive, that she starts to wear all of the black clothes. And the black clothes, incidentally, cost way more than any other clothes. So they're a huge status symbol. But before that, she's wearing all different colours.
Yeah,
it would be good to see.
It's hard for us to imagine her like that because she is always this dour, nunly figure, the mother of Henry VII, the evil mother-in-law of Elizabeth of York. I can't wait to get into all this. So we have to start at the beginning, and I'm sure this gets boring. And let's just talk about real briefly her lineage. Where does she come from and what makes her so special?
Yeah, I felt exactly this way when I was writing the book. I was like, oh my God, I have to start with this whole unpacking of who these people are. And they're all called John or Margaret, all of them in her family. I genuinely started to think, can I just change their names? Can I call one of them Stanley at that point? That would have been confusing for later. Anyway, yes. So the way I chose to see it is that for Margaret herself and for all noble people, it was really important who you were related to and how you had whatever land, rights, whatever it might be. So for Margaret, she was really concerned with her maternal line, interestingly. And her mother is someone about whom very little is really known. She's called Margaret Beauchamp. She gets married 3 times. To 3 different men. One of them is a duke, and that is Margaret's father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. And through him, she is descended from way back when, Edward III. as many people are in the 15th century, it must be said.
Yeah.
And the Beauforts have a bit of a strange position because they are the children of John of Gaunt. So they are related to the Lancastrians, sort of by half-blood, but they are technically illegitimate. They're, wrong side of the bedsheet. So they don't kind of have an official claim to the throne in the same way like the Yorkists do. But they are closer to the Lancastrians, who are the ruling power when Margaret is born. So, yeah, for her, the key thing to know is that she is an heiress in her own right. She has a royal connection. She's supremely rich. And her father dies before she's 1. So all of this happens to her, like even before she has memory, really. And then she grows up with her mother and with this like great big brood of half siblings.
Yeah. Okay, so because of her status, she was very desirable in the marriage market. I think that's fair to say, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Let's talk about that first marriage, the one that I feel like people are like, well, it was a marriage, it wasn't a marriage. Let's go there.
Yeah, let's go there. Let's go. Betrothal per verba de futura. So when, as you say, Margaret, very wealthy, very important, blood claim. But because her father is dead, she becomes technically a ward of court, a ward of the king, Henry VI, which means that her mother no longer has any real legal rights to her. Margaret can just be handed over to whoever the king says. And the king's leading advisor at this time is a man called the Duke of Suffolk, very powerful, quite kindly. I feel due for some revisiting. He's been a bit maligned. And the Duke, unsurprisingly, is like, oh, I have a son. He's about your age, Margaret. I know. Oh, why don't you just marry him? Why don't you just marry him? And then coincidentally, I will get all your money and also your royal claim, which ends badly for the Duke because he ends up being beheaded. So it doesn't quite work out for him. It doesn't entirely work out for Margaret either. The one thing that is fortunate in many ways is that although Margaret technically is betrothed or like married, but not fully married yet, to the son of the Duke of Suffolk, she stays with her mother. So she could have, at 6 or 7 years old, just been carted off to this complete other family. And instead, her mother is clearly doing what she can to kind of protect Margaret for as long as possible, which works until Margaret is 12, which is legal marrying age in the Middle Ages for a girl.
Yeah. And then she gets Edmund Tudor, doesn't she?
Yes.
I just, that whole story with him, I don't know how to feel about it, honestly. And I feel like maybe you and I have the same take on it, where it was kind of like he was pushing real hard to be connected to that money.
Yeah, I think so. The Tudors are an anomaly at this time. Again, actually, like the Beauforts, they're half-blood connections to the crown, but kind of even lower than the Beauforts. They're descended from a servant and a French queen / king's mother who doesn't really have any power at this point. And I think I personally have a theory that maybe Henry VI, the Lancastrian king at that time, he doesn't have any heirs of his own, immediate heirs. So he's kind of, maybe with the help of some other people around him, trying to set up Edmund Tudor and Margaret Beaufort to create a kind of Lancastrian trustworthy line. Unfortunately for Margaret, like I say, she's 12, and Edmund, we don't know exactly, but definitely late 20s. And at this time in history, as much as a husband has a right to insist on sex within marriage, it's not usual, even in the noble classes, for people to be like pushing that right until a wife is older. It's usually like 16 or something. We know of loads of marriages where people are married for like 10 years before they start having children. So the fact that Edmund marries Margaret as soon as she's 12, takes her off to Wales with him, like removes her completely from her support network, and then very promptly gets her pregnant, suggests to me that he is a piece of work. Like, essentially, I think all he cares about is his own sort of self-promotion and wealth. And it's, yeah, it doesn't end well for him either, because he ends up dying of the plague before this child that he's impregnated Margaret with is even born.
Do you think, I always look at Edmund Tudor and Jasper Tudor, they were brothers, but when we look at them as people, to me, they seem like totally different people. Did you kind of get that impression too?
I think so, as much as we can tell, because there's so little about them. Like, we often talk about how there's not much about women at this time, but like, honestly, there's not much about people at this time in history. You're having to like read across things so much to make sense of them. I think maybe they're a bit like the Stanley brothers later on. I think you've got one person who's really protective and out for what they can get for their family, and one person who is like, no, I will go and fight the battles. I will, risk myself for the good of our family. And I think that might be what Edmund and Jasper have, is you have the older brother protector and the younger brother goes out and fights in a battle. But I have uncertain feelings about Jasper, because I'm not sure I don't think he was the warm and fuzzy, lovely fellow. I think he was a fighter. I think that was just who he was and his identity. He lives in exile for years. He doesn't seem to have had that happy a marriage later on. I just get the feeling he's quite an insular military man.
So are you telling me that the White Queen, that whole series, had it wrong? That Jasper wasn't this love-torn soldier?
No, I don't think so. I don't think if Jasper Tudor cared. I think maybe he was concerned for the protection of Henry Tudor and his family, which by extension would include Margaret. I definitely don't think there's anything romantic between the two of them at all. And even by the standards of the time, like, if you just have to think of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon later on, if you marry your brother's widow, technically it can be considered incest. So I don't think they would have conceived of it as a thing that might be a viable option for them. And I get no sense whatsoever that they had feelings for each other beyond this association through Henry.
She was maybe more like a sister, but not.
Yes, quite a young sister as well.
I do want to go back just a little bit, because you mentioned Catherine of Valois. And I just feel like this was a part of the early part of your book that was kind of like a bomb went off for me, because you had made mention about a possible relationship between Catherine and Edmund Beaufort.
Yes.
And that just blew my mind. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I can. So I think it's 1427 that this comes up, before Catherine is involved with Owen Tudor, her servant, to the best of our knowledge. And Edmund Beaufort, second Duke of Somerset, is the brother of Margaret's father. So that's their connection there. And he, when his brother dies, kind of inherits this senior position in the family. He inherits loads of the lands of his brother, and he becomes Henry VI's leading advisor to Henry VI's much more important and interesting wife, Margaret of Anjou. And I think it's very revealing of Edmund Beaufort that he has some sort of dalliance with Catherine Valois for a while. And then there is this Act of Parliament, I think, put in place that says if there is, the mother of a king or the widow of a king, she will lose all of her estates if she marries someone else, essentially. And Edmund's like, okay, bye.
I'm out.
Yeah, immediately. He's like, okay, see you later. I'm going to get married to someone else with lots of land.
Oh, wow. So typical of the time, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting because although he ends that relationship with Catherine, he continues to have a very close relationship with Henry VI and with his queen, and is kind of a father figure to him, and potentially also to Margaret. We know that Edmund's wife later, when they're fleeing from the outcome of the Battle of St. Albans, the first battle of the Wars of the Roses, the family go to Margaret's mother's house and are hiding out there. So, there's all of these continued relationships, I guess, between these people.
Yeah. I'm just so fascinated. Before we started recording, the Wars of the Roses, or War of the Roses, it's like the most fascinating period of English history to me. And I know there's so many periods of English history, but I just find it so interesting, the battles that happened and the reasons that they happened. And it just seems like it was constantly people grasping at power. And then you have little Margaret in the mix of all of this, just trying to survive.
Yeah, I think exactly that. And I mean, in many ways, it's sort of representative, I think, her experience, that the thing that most endangers her is giving birth which she does when she's really far too young and probably not even fully physically developed. But like that's sort of in a nutshell, the challenge of women at this time is, it can be very dangerous to have children, and especially in the situation Margaret does, where she doesn't have her husband there, she doesn't have her mother or her siblings there, she hasn't got a support network as far as we know, she just has whoever her servants are that she's managed to cobble together and bring to Pembroke Castle. And I think that the trauma, and I would use that word advisedly, like the trauma of that experience stays with her for, possibly the rest of her life. We know that it is still referred to right at the end of her life. So I think it lingers with her.
Yeah, because she never had any children after Henry.
No, and we don't know if it's because she wanted them, which is slightly my suspicion, that she wanted them but couldn't have them. Because probably of the psychological and physical fallout of this. Or it is also possible that she chose not to, that she did not maybe have sexual relations with her husbands, or possibly that contraception was used because it could sort of, in that wishy-washy way, you could make an argument for using contraception, even though technically it was illegal. My suspicion, like I say, I think she probably expected and wanted more children, and that part of the reason we see really kind of an absence from Henry's life for the first several years of his life on Margaret's part is that she thought, well, I've got remarried, I'm going to have kids, doesn't matter. And then at a certain point she goes, this isn't happening. Yeah. Maybe he is my entire future. Maybe this is the child I am going to have, and I need to rebuild that relationship.
How do you top your love for your cat? With a cascade of decadent, savory gravy over a mouth-watering mousse pâté. Fancy Feast Gems. 2 gourmet pâtés in one convenient pack. Simply peel and plate to reveal a pyramid shape that makes eating delightful, and pamper her with an experience as extraordinary as she is. Turn the everyday into the extraordinary with Fancy Feast Gems.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we have to talk about her marriage to Stafford, because I think my impression always was that it was an amicable marriage, but there maybe wasn't any love there. And I feel like reading your book that I have a whole different impression of the marriage between these two. Let's talk about this.
Yeah, I really like I call him Harry Stafford. He's sometimes called Henry Stafford. He does sign himself Harry at times. I really like him. Yes, I think I probably had a similar impression of him. Like, again, we don't know exactly when he's born, but probably he's 10, even 20 years older than Margaret. He's definitely older when they get married in 1458, and she is still 14 at this point, lest we forget. But what's really clear when you read like the household accounts that they keep together of all of their expenditure and their payments to servants and things, and also his will, which he writes 2 different wills, but both of them kind of have similar terminology used about Margaret. It's like it just really seems like it was affectionate and companionate and respectful. I think that's the big thing. And the situation with Edmund Tudor is really difficult to make sense of, but it doesn't feel respectful in any way towards Margaret. Whereas Harry Stafford seems to he realizes that Margaret, she's the one who has the money, she's the one who has the social status, and she's smart. Like right from childhood, she's described as being very astute. So I think, yeah, it just seems like a happy marriage. And for me, it was really noticeable because Margaret gets married to him extremely quickly after Henry Tudor is born. And she moves with him to his estates, which are right near where her mother lives and where Margaret had grown up. I really get this strong sense that by marrying him, she's kind of going back to her own childhood in a certain way. Like she's being able to go, right, that horrible stuff that happened with Edmund Tudor didn't happen. I can just move on from it. And his family as well. They're a powerful family with a powerful woman at the head of them. And I think that that's really important to how Margaret develops too.
There is something. So I can relate to her in this respect because I was married and divorced. And when I got divorced, the first thing I wanted to do was be close to home to find myself again. So I can completely relate to her in that respect. There's nothing wrong with it. I feel like sometimes people look down on it like, oh, you're going home, right? Like, why would you do that? But there was a comfort to her to be there near her mother again.
Yeah, and I think we forget those human elements to these stories, that it's not just all about like big ideas of estates and territories and realms. It's a human thing. It's like, where are my people? They're here. That's where I want to be.
Yes, exactly. You mentioned how intelligent Margaret was. And I don't think I realized what a reader she was until you had mentioned that I think it was her mother-in-law later gifted her books in her will. Let's talk about her education a little. I know kind of jumping all over the place, but you mentioned she was intelligent. So let's go there.
Yeah, she's I mean, inevitably, because a churchman writes this, he kind of says, "Oh, she was much more intelligent than women usually are." Yeah, like thanks, John Fisher. Fine. But clearly, yeah, she has this like quickness, I would say, which seems to be there in her mother as well. It seems to be there in Henry Tudor later on. She has a real aptitude. I mean, effectively, she's kind of bilingual. She speaks English, but she also understands French well enough that in later life, she's translating entire religious works from French into English and then having them published. Like, she's a real force, I think. And as well as her mother-in-law, also Cecily Neville, the mother of Edward IV and Richard III, gives Margaret a book in her will as well. It's a religious book, so, it has a religious, spiritual meaning as well as a kind of educational one. But yeah, I think we don't know much about how she was educated. We can assume that she was educated kind of in a gendered way. So boys tended to have maybe slightly more formal education, more formal tutoring, military training, potentially, that sort of thing. They might learn Latin. Margaret, never any good at Latin, as she complains later in life. But I think the really big thing, and what I wanted to kind of get across in the book, is that Margaret, like most of the women in her time, grew up and was kind of almost apprenticed to her own mother. Like, that was her source of education, was just seeing how her mother was able to do things or not do things. And I think it's something that later on with Elizabeth of York is actually really important, that I think Elizabeth of York similarly has learnt by observation how to behave. And in Margaret Beaufort's case, we have someone who I think imitates her mother. And in Elizabeth of York, I think we have someone who chooses to be totally different from her mother because of what had happened. And I think that's really interesting.
Oh gosh, and so much happened. The War of the Roses is just fascinating. And you mentioned too, when you talk about this period of history, but you mentioned when she comes to court, and I think it was the first time when she meets her cousin, Henry VI. And correct me if I'm mistaken, but I think that's when you had mentioned that Henry VI mentioned something about her son, Henry, which I think fueled the idea of him maybe becoming king one day.
Yeah, this is an interesting bit of spin, I feel like, from the Tudors. This alleged prophecy that occurs with Henry VI actually happens a few years later. It happens during the insane time of the readeption, as it's called in England, where you've had Lancastrians, then you've had Yorkists, then you have a Lancastrian again, then you go back to York. It's absolutely mad. The key is that Henry VI, very briefly, having been a prisoner for years and years, is sort of wheeled out to be king again. And Margaret Beaufort, in a very unusual moment in her life, is actually with her son, Henry, and kind of goes out publicly with him, and they're able to spend time together. They visit Henry VI, and allegedly a prophecy is made by Henry, who is seen as a holy figure, a very pious figure, in which he says that this 12-year-old in front of him, Henry Tudor, will be king one day. Now, the difficulty is that we know that the meeting definitely happened because it's recorded at the time. We don't know what Henry VI actually said at the meeting. We only have the Tudors later on reporting it. But it is reported specifically by people who are talking to the court and to Henry and to Margaret. And so I suspect it is a story that they have told. And it kind of ties in with the fact that Margaret herself claimed that she had had a vision that she would marry Edmund Tudor as well. And that seems to have been linked with Henry VI too. So I think, like, firstly, I think Margaret and maybe to a lesser degree Henry VII really believed that Henry VI was a holy figure and that there was something slightly supernatural maybe about him. And also maybe something was said. I don't know if I totally believe that Henry VI was like, oh yeah, I've definitely, this is the guy, this one here, despite the fact there are literally about 15 people in this room who could also be king. It's this one. But it makes sense later that they remember it that way.
Yeah, yes, it does make sense, doesn't it? She must have learned so much about politics during this time and trying to weave her way and decide which side to align with. She didn't always align with Lancastrians. She aligned with York sometimes too, didn't she?
Yeah. I think it's a big, like, sort of misapprehension of this era that almost like football teams, you have your, like, I'm the red team, woo woo. Like, no, they totally switch between them because there's a brilliant quote by someone who similarly was a Lancastrian and becomes a Yorkist. And he says, like, I was never so mad that I would with a dead man strive against the quick, by which he means, like, it's insane if you're like, if the person you want to support is going to die or is dead, you give them up. You go for the other one. And I think Margaret does exactly that, is that she tries to work out who is in the ascendant and ally with them. And actually, a number of times she gets it wrong, especially during this sort of readaptation period. She supports George, Duke of Clarence, even though he's in rebellion against Edward IV. She supports Henry VI, even though he gets, murdered probably and certainly deposed by Edward IV. So she kind of gets herself in a really difficult position by 1471 when the Lancastrians are definitively defeated. And the Yorkists are just 100% in control of things under Edward IV, because her husband, Harry Stafford, dies, possibly as part of complication from wounds he received in battle, possibly a longer-term illness. Her son, Henry Tudor, is almost forced into exile because of the threat of this Lancastrian blood claim he has and his connection with Jasper Tudor. And so Margaret has totally made the wrong calls in recent times, and Edward IV doesn't trust her anymore, and she has no allies around her. And I think it's really interesting that at that point in time, she decides to marry Thomas Stanley, the arch pragmatist of the Wars of the Roses, that she's like, someone who never chooses a side. This could be the guy. This is the one.
I'm so fascinated by her story. And I love, there was a part in your book too, where you had mentioned that while all this is going on and her son Henry's life is in danger, she says to Jasper something like, take him away, take him across the sea. And even though the sea is just as dangerous, let's take that risk and send him over there.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, it's something like it's less dangerous than this tempest on land. It's to be fair, it's written down later by a humanist, so it makes sense that it's lovely the way he describes it. But you can definitely imagine Margaret making that warning, and we know that later she also warns Henry not to come back when Edward IV is trying to get him back. And it's only once she has got some really concrete kind of deals made that she changes her mind about Edward IV.
Yeah. Edward IV, George, Duke of Clarence, Richard of Gloucester, those three, there was just so much drama with them. And before we jump forward, because we only have so much time, I do want to talk a little bit about one of these preconceived notions about Cecily Neville. Mm-hmm. And I think everyone always thinks, because of the White Queen, reading that book, watching the TV series, that Cecily Neville was the one who drove the charge to get her son Edward IV removed from the throne. But when I was reading your book, I feel like I had this eye-opening moment where it seems like maybe it wasn't her, and that it was actually George, Edward's brother, who came up with this.
Oh yeah, I don't think so. I think Margaret is not Margaret, sorry. I think Cecily Neville is always trying to make peace between her incredibly irritating sons. That's the impression I get. It's just she's constantly, it's like dealing with puppies or something. It's like, just go over in your corner, stop invading. And it's interesting because George, Duke of Clarence, I think, has got quite a bad reputation historically, and the men in his family certainly seem to find him unbearable, to the point his own brother has him killed. But the women in his family clearly really like him. There was something there about him that was obviously very endearing. And it's always interesting, I think, when you look at things from that slightly different perspective of, okay, well, what are the women feeling? What are the women saying? What are they doing? And how are they behaving with these people? But there's no two ways about it. I suspect that Edward IV was Cecily's favourite. That's my impression.
Yeah.
He's the golden boy, quite literally. And I think it's very difficult because two of her sons, Clarence and Gloucester, both at some point suggest that Edward IV is illegitimate in order to sort of further their own causes.
Yeah.
And imagine saying that about your own mother, being like, oh yeah, our mother definitely, she had an affair with an archer. Bizarre. And yet, because, and again, this is something that tends to be overlooked in women because they're presented as too emotional or something. It's like, she is incredibly pragmatic about this. She's like, yes, they shouldn't have done that. I am offended, but I would prefer they made peace with each other and just got on. So yeah, I think Cecily is just trying to kind of navigate this terrible mess as well. And I think that Margaret Beaufort kind of works with Cecily at certain points where maybe it's been obscured a bit in history or, covered up, who knows. But I definitely think the two of them work together. And I think Margaret sees a lot of maybe her future self in Cecily.
And then we have Margaret forming an alliance with Elizabeth Woodville a little bit later on to bring us to the Tudors, right? So I think, Margaret definitely learned from Cecily and all that had happened prior to that. Elizabeth Woodville lived it. She experienced all the trauma that came with it. And in the end, they come together and decide that the best option is to form a union between their two families.
Yeah, absolutely. So after Richard, Duke of Gloucester, takes the throne and becomes Richard III, there is this sort of uncertain period where people are just trying to work out which side they want to be on. I suspect that Margaret would have preferred the Woodvilles to stay in power and for Edward V, the child son, one of the princes in the Tower, to stay in power. But because that has not happened, she's like, okay, well, we have to go with Richard for a while. We'll see what happens. And I think it really soon becomes clear that Richard's hold on power is not as it's not as firm as people at the time might like of their king, and that there is some suspicion about what has happened to the princes. And there is undoubtedly a big rebellion within the first weeks of Richard III's reign, which suggests that there's a kind of groundswell of dissatisfaction, and that Margaret, I think probably personally, was unhappy with the situation, as well as politically thinking, well, this could be to my advantage. And the other thing to say is that part of the reason Margaret makes an alliance with Elizabeth Woodville is that before Edward IV died and the whole situation with Richard III comes to pass, Margaret had been working with Edward IV to try and get Henry back, to get him restored as the Earl, and to have him marry Elizabeth of York, probably, at that point in time. So, Edward IV's death just totally wrecks this plan, and she's just trying to kind of make sure that she can restore it in some way by this association with Elizabeth Woodville, which, because of the really fraught circumstances that have been unleashed by Richard III, lead to the two women uniting essentially in rebellion.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like we're just having to skim over so much right now, but if you want to know more, you're going to have to read Lauren's book. Okay.
There we go.
I appreciate when we're talking about the marriage of Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York, you had mentioned something about them having like a private ceremony before the public ceremony, which then kind of makes the birth of Arthur Tudor make a little bit more sense.
Yes. It's fascinating, isn't it? And again, it's like one of those, do they really like each other? Is it just a political marriage? I think a bit of both. Is that Henry VII, as he becomes, having defeated Richard III in battle, marries Elizabeth of York officially in January 1486. Their first child is born the following September, so 8 months for maths fans. Customarily, 9 months is the traditional amount of time for a baby to gestate. And there is definitely something going on around December 1485. There's probably it's preparations being made for the wedding. They, complicated backstory, but they need a papal dispensation to arrive in time, and they haven't quite got it. But it seems likely that something happens privately with the two of them that kind of cements the fact that they are married. And at this time in history, like even with the most public, the most recorded marriages, there's actually like potentially multiple different stages to the marriage process. That there's like, you promise to marry each other, then you promise to marry each other again, then you actually meet, then you have another promise, and then you have an official wedding, and then there's another bit. So I think it's maybe not completely unusual. And maybe just they liked each other. It's possible.
It is totally possible. We always look for the negative, like they must have hated each other. She was stuck in this awful marriage. Well, maybe they liked each other. Margaret Beaufort loved her first husband, or her second, third.
Yeah.
Stafford.
Some of them. Yep.
However, we're going to number them. When you talk about Elizabeth of York going to have her son Arthur, and we're talking about the setup in the room, and you had mentioned in your book that I think we all have the impression that Margaret Beaufort controlled everything. She was the one who was there, but the likelihood is probably greater that Elizabeth of York's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had a lot to do with it because she had had a brood of children.
Yeah, there's this kind of version of Margaret's story which ties in with this notion she's a terrible mother-in-law, that she wrote what are called the household ordinances, which are like rules for the ceremony of loads of things to do with the royal court, one of which is what happens when the Queen gives birth. And as soon as you hear that, you think, God, that's awful, that this poor woman is trying to give birth and she's got all these stupid rules that have been put in place that are imposed on her by her mother-in-law. But it's not the case, because actually these specific household ordinances were not written by Margaret. Like several hundred years later, someone just wrote on it, that Margaret Beaufort wrote these. And there's no reason why they thought that. And we do know of one specific ordinance that Margaret wrote after Elizabeth had died. And very clearly we know it's Margaret's, because she specifically says, like, by Margaret, Countess of Richmond. It's very clear. So it doesn't seem likely at all that Margaret was the one directing things. Whereas we know that Elizabeth Woodville, firstly, was really big on ceremony. There's other instances of like her making the women in her presence kneel in front of her for hours while she's having her dinner. And as you say, she had multiple children. So like Margaret Beaufort never gave birth as queen. Elizabeth Woodville gave birth as queen loads. Who are you going to ask for advice?
Yeah. One of the other things that just popped into my mind when I said a brood of children reminded me, but now I'm going to step back in time a little bit too, but it's also related to this period in history. When Margaret Beaufort married Stanley, he had, was it like 10 children at the time?
He had 10 children. They're not all alive by the time he marries Margaret, but a number of them are. And like certainly one of them seems to have been still quite young, like a child. Some of them were in their teens. So yeah, Margaret becomes a stepmother to those children and continues to be involved in their lives, their children's lives. And again, I think that's a bit of Margaret's story that tends to kind of just be brushed over, because we see her as the mother of Henry VII And actually, she is also someone who maintains relationships with people over like generations of their family, or with her servants, or with her half siblings and other people who are distantly related to her. And she is very clearly invested in those people and concerned for them in a way that like is really human and kind. And like it's just not an aspect of a historical woman you tend to get an insight into, but because of her, again, her household accounts that we have for a long period of her life, we can get those little like snippets of the people she's supporting and keeping in touch with. And I think it's a really important aspect of her that gets forgotten.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought it up, because that was the first time that I had ever read that. And I thought this just, it paints a different picture of her than what I had imagined.
Yeah, she's not just this like single figure by herself. She's a woman surrounded by others.
Yes. So I would suspect between having Henry and these stepchildren, this really aided her in possibly being a good grandmother.
Yeah, I think so. And like there's so many examples of her giving gifts or being a godmother, or like a lot of children called Margaret who pop up at various points around her, which I suspect is that they're named for her. And again, we know that she gives a lot of gifts to her grandchildren, to the four who survive, in particular Arthur, well, who survived for some time, Arthur, Henry, Margaret and Mary. And even when Princess Margaret, so Margaret Beaufort's granddaughter, who goes and marries the King of Scotland, even after she has left the country and is hundreds of miles away, Margaret is still in communication with her granddaughter and with her servants. Like anytime these servants come back to England, they call in with Margaret and obviously give her, you know, a kind of update on the situation. So yeah, it's not like out of sight, out of mind in this era, definitely.
Yeah. I could talk about Margaret with you for hours, and I feel like we have only scratched the surface when it comes to her. Was there anything when you started the research on her, did you have an idea of who she was that maybe changed after your research?
Yeah, I think so. And I think there were also points in the research where I didn't like her as much. Like that whole period when she's sort of flip-flopping between different factions, between Yorkists, between Lancastrian, between the different brothers of the House of York, like, but when she's kind of profiting from other people's disadvantage as well in that period. You know, that's not the best aspect of a personality. But then having spent a long time with those household accounts, with like the small number of letters and things that we have for her, it just really like rounded out who I felt she was as a person. And it's very difficult to kind of get all of that stuff into a book, because like other people are not quite as interested in the very clear specifics of, oh, on this day she went to this shrine and on this day she visited this altar, you know, whatever it might be. But I hope I've sort of tried to get some of that human nature to her in, because I think that was the biggest surprise to me, was that even though this is a woman who, you know, was born 570 years ago, like I felt by the end of the book I had such a strong sense of her as a person, and as a person actually I would like and I would have liked to have met. And there's this really touching description of her, which is right towards the end of the book, written by one of her servants, Henry Parker, which is written, in fact, for her great-granddaughter, for Queen Mary I. And he describes how, like, she was a perfect light for all the world to follow. Like, even with the distance of 40 years since she died, you could still feel that he was so impressed by this great woman that it continued, and he saw her as an inspiration still. And I just found that so touching, that she clearly had such importance to the people around her, as well as being a politically important figure.
Yeah. Well, thank you for showing us this side of Margaret that maybe we haven't seen before. Your book, Margaret Beaufort, Survival, Rebel, Kingmaker, it's coming out very soon, isn't it?
It's out the 6th of November in the UK, and then in March, beginning of March in America.
Yeah, we might have to have you back again before March, just as a little refresher to make people
Please.
make sure.
There's so much I've still got to say.
There's so much that we did not cover today. I felt like we jumped all over the place, but there's like so many little important pieces of her story that I wanted to touch base on. And Lauren, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tudorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. You can also join the conversation with me on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time, thanks for keeping history alive with me.